Hey everyone, happy Wednesday, day number 3. Our topic for today is the idea of national cuisine and whether there is such thing as American cuisine. And we will not answer these questions definitively. It's impossible. The point is to think about how we should think about it. On one hand, the idea of national food is a very sensical way of thinking about food because the idea of a nation is something we're so comfortable with. We learn it from such a young age. The world is divided into countries, and it becomes a shortcut for different kinds of people and customs and traditions and food. So we use the idea of national food as a way of describing a range of food dishes, ingredients, spices that you frequently find in a particular geography. On the other hand, it's totally arbitrary, the idea of a national food, because many countries, even small ones, have lots of regions with different specialties, different techniques, different spices, different ingredients, and so on. As we've seen, foodways change over time. Tastes change, cultural tastes change over time. So the idea of a national food, if you think about these variables, doesn't make as much sense as you might think. So national food is both sensical and arbitrary at the same time, and there's no way around this paradox. So really the question is, how do we think about it? What use is it to think in terms of national foods? What do we get out of it, and what are the dangers? So the most important point to keep in mind as you go through the readings and think about your first reading reflection due today, there are no right answers. Okay, my goal with today's topic is to entice you to consider your own assumptions and definitions and values when it comes to thinking about national cuisine, and become able to sort of understand other people's assumptions and definitions and values when you're having conversations about different kinds of foodways. When you think of Italian food, Chinese, Mexican, what do you think of? And why is that? What do other people think of? Why do they think of those things? How can we use these sort of automatic assumptions about what constitutes a kind of food as a way of thinking about our assumptions about other people, about other places, and so on? You have a few different readings for today. There's I think 5 different things on the syllabus. They're all very short, and there's a lot of overlap between them, but they all have a unique voice, a unique perspective that I think is worth considering, especially when you put them all together, and that's what the reading reflections ask you to do. And today, we're using food, as we do so many days in this class, to get at much larger questions about identity, heritage, nationality, and again, my hope is that you see food as a really interesting window into these different sort of things that are really hard to talk about, right? How do you talk about heritage and identity and nationality? Food is one angle, right? There's a lot of different angles, but food is a really useful one, and it's the easy one, and it's one we're all familiar with to some extent. Okay, so the various readings prompt us to consider what might constitute an American cuisine. Is American cuisine simply a sum of regional parts? So when we say American cuisine, are we really talking about the combination of New England food and Southern food and Tex-Mex and New Mexican and Southwestern and Midwestern and hot dishes and casseroles? I'm from Minnesota, so Midwestern food is comfort food for me. The Northwest, pick a region, right? And even micro-regions have their own traditions. Or is the idea of American cuisine ultimately foiled by this regionality? Do we have too much diversity to say there is any one kind of cuisine that we could label as American? Right? Or does that diversity constitute the hallmark feature of American cuisine? Is that the one thing that's unique about American cuisine, is that it encompasses all these other ones? When we think about national food, American food, or any kind of food, geography is a very easy way of defining what constitutes national food. It's food that you can get in that place, that's sort of native to that place, that sort of has a history or tradition there. One of the noteworthy articles in the readings for today, Alison Smith's National Cuisine article, it's in the Oxford Handbook of Food History, so it's very encyclopedic in scope. So let me just summarize the point here. We know historically, and you already know this, goods have moved from place to place forever, right? And foodways, food traditions are part of this sort of transplantation as well. And sometimes food can move into a place and become almost synonymous with it and become almost like a native food, even though we have clear documentation of the fact that the food was brought there from somewhere else. It's almost like an invasive species. So one easy example here is the tomato in Italian food, for instance. We think of spaghetti and meatballs and tomato sauce as quintessential Italian food, or pizza sauce or whatever. Tomato is a New World crop, right? There's nothing authentic or sort of historically accurate about the tomato being in the long history of Italian food. Across much of Africa, New World crops like cassava and corn have sort of overtaken and displaced native sorghum and millet that were the predominant crops before then. So clearly, when we're thinking about national food, we have to think about the chronological dimension as well as the geographic one. So when you say something is a national cuisine, well, you have to ask yourself the question of when. One of my favorite points is how American cuisine might be tied to values about time. Two senses of time come to mind when we think about food and time. One is the idea of sort of time we spend on making and getting food. On one hand, we're supposed to be very busy and industrious Americans. We work hard. We're not supposed to spend time cooking. It's kind of a waste of time. We try to get food as fast as we can. We take it with us. We eat at our desks. We eat in our cars. We buy frozen stuff that we can just defrost. Fast food, obviously, ubiquitous everywhere. Does this define American food? Obviously not for everybody, but is that a predominant view? On the other hand, isn't it a sign of status or cultural refinement to have the luxury of spending time on food? Does that somehow represent American interest in food? We can buy ingredients from literally all over the world, different ethnic markets in every city, gather different kinds of ingredients, go on YouTube, find recipes for whatever you want, replicate other cultures' food. You can spend time learning new stuff. Isn't that fundamentally American? I mean, where else are people doing that as much as we are? So that's time, when we think about time we spend with food, maybe that defines American cuisine in some way. Another sense of time is how long does a food need to be in a place, in a geographic place, before it becomes part of that place, it becomes a food of that place? Can a food or dish or cuisine grow roots somewhere else? And how long does that take? An easy example here is the hamburger. If you asked 100 people, what's a quintessential American food? If you can name just one, I'm guessing half at least are going to say hamburger. Is it more American now? And few people would really sort of argue with that. But is that burger more American now than in the 1890s when it was invented by German immigrants who were making a living selling food to factory workers who were now moving further from their homes to work in factories that were getting further away from cities and needed lunch on the go, chopping up hamburger steak, right? So now we use ground beef, but hamburger steak, you're in the middle of the street, people are moving quickly, you don't have time, there's no forks. What do? Put it between bread and make the hamburger. Is this American? Well, there's not a lot of Americans doing stuff. There's German immigrants selling it to Italians, Irish, English, other immigrants working in factories, industrializing America, a lot of people moving into cities. But on the other hand, what's more American than that? All these different people, ingenuity, creating, a commodity, chopping up your steak, making a new thing, making fast food, basically. Isn't that the quintessential American food? One of the readings for today, Ruth Tobias riffs on this idea and has a great quote that I wanted to make sure you catch. American food is foreign food until it isn't. American food is defined by a process of assimilation. Other ideas that might define American food. Convenience, again, getting back to the issues of time. Corporate capital. Food industry is pretty big. Technology, it's amazing. The amount of technology that goes into our food. You have crunchy chips, you have crisp vegetables, fresh food, the frozen food that you can get, the convenience food doesn't turn into gray sludge because it's got so many emulsifiers and preservatives and dyes and other things that make it tasty, that make it safe, that make it fun to eat. Technology is everywhere, and it may be more so in this country than other places. Maybe technology is what defines American cuisine. Another idea, not in the reading, but I think it's really relevant here, something I think a lot about. We'll get to this a little bit more next week. How much is American food about freedom? And how important is the idea of freedom in trying to define what American food is? There are three different perspectives I think that are worth thinking about here very quickly in terms of freedom. Freedom for food. Early America, the Jeffersonian vision for agrarian America was everyone was going to have their own land and sort of work the bounty of the earth with their own labor, produce extra stuff. So they feed their families, but they'd be able to sell the extra, create more capital and social mobility, more freedom through food. And you wanted freedom to sell your food where you wanted. You didn't want to be burdened by interstate commerce laws. You didn't want to be unfairly taxed by some other country. Freedom to do what you wanted to do with your food, right? That's hugely important for early American ideas about revolution, about freedom, about national identity. Later on, thanks to capital accumulations and food industrialization, we get freedom from food. We don't have to cook anything. Industrial food makes a huge array of foods readily accessible with a long shelf life. They're generally safe. In the 1830s, right? Not 1930s, 1830s, so quite a while ago, 200 years, people really started buying most of their food, right? A huge turning point in civilization, really. And this is just in the US, where people are buying more food in the 1830s. But that's a huge shift when you go from the self-sufficiency, sort of agrarian household, to more people living in cities and buying stuff. That's a remarkable change. Freedom from food. And the last point about freedom to make here is freedom with food. The idea of ethnic choice. This is the point of the Ed Lee video that you'll watch, very short, just a couple minutes. Where else but in the US do you ask, what kind of cuisine am I having for dinner? Convenience, technology, time, freedom. These are all ways we might define American cuisine, but these are all very different kinds of things, and they're very different kinds of things from the traditional way we talk about national food, right? In terms of dishes, or in terms of spices, or in terms of certain ingredients or techniques. Are these broader abstract things like freedom and technology, are they even a fair category to use to think about a cuisine? Are they too abstract? Are they too philosophical? I don't think that's ever possible. For the last reading on the list, and again, I hope you read these in order so they kind of prime you for the next one as you go. The last reading, Sidney Mintz, Eating American. His point is to argue that there's no such thing as American cuisine, and that's okay. And we're not reading it because he's right. I actually disagree with a lot of what he says, but he makes a pretty clear and direct statement about it, and it's very useful to think about. Nothing in this class we read because it's correct and I want you to believe it. It's because it's provocative. And we should engage with it, even if we completely disagree. Mintz argues that American cuisine is fundamentally fusion food and lacking a distinct culinary idea or identity. It's too regional and it's too diverse, and so there's just really no, the central sort of concept that you can use to define American food. And he tries to say that this is fine and explain himself, but there is something kind of off-putting about someone telling you you don't have a cuisine. Right? If somebody said there's no such thing as American art or American literature, you'd say, what are you talking about? Is it okay not to have a national cuisine? Does it make us culturally deficient in some way? Would it mean that there's no American anything if we don't have American food? Does it highlight our uniqueness in the world, or does it make us, completely unoriginal? Okay, I want to end with one last reminder, a big picture point to keep in mind for this topic of national cuisine. When we read anything about national food, or you're talking to your friend about it, we have to think about where all these assumptions about what constitutes a national food are coming from. Where do we get the food stereotypes that we do? And that's what national cuisine is. It's a stereotype, right? Which is partly useful and partly silly. What experiences inform those? When someone's talking about national food, what do they mean? Where are they talking about? When? Are they thinking about things like time or freedom or tradition or nostalgia? Are they talking about innovation and technology? Are they talking about ingredients? However you answer these questions about food stereotypes, I think a lot of our answers stem from values that we have far outside of food. But the question of how do we use food to understand something like national identity is the kind of thing that we do basically for every topic in this class, to think about sort of when we look at history through the lens of food, what can we see that we can't see with other lenses? I want to make a very quick note about reading responses, since the first one is due today. Normally I don't talk about these. I think they're pretty clear on the syllabus. I just want to highlight one thing. Let me bring up the syllabus here. Okay, here we are, National Cuisine and American Food, June 8th. Here's the readings for today. Good stuff in the noteworthy section. Again, that's optional. Reading reflection assignment due today. Here's the red box you need to look at. Make sure you're familiar with the reading reflection guide. I mentioned this in the introductory video about the class, but what you need to do is written out here. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. The main point of these reflections is to show your familiarity with the readings and make clear the work you've put into the course. Okay, that is the most important thing on this page, to make sure that your reflections reflect the work you're putting into the class. Okay, there's never a right answer. I've mentioned that before, it's worth repeating. There's never a right answer. 350 words minimum. That goes by really fast when you're addressing very broad questions like what is national food. Remember, longer responses that cover more material, that's the key part of that phrase, gets extra points, okay? So we don't need to sort of nitpick and worry about individual points here and there. There's always chances to get more points by showing you're doing more work. It's very, very straightforward. You can get whatever grade you want very easily. Please do not summarize the readings. That's not the point of the exercise. The reading reflections are to get you to read the different opinions that show up in the different articles and then put them together to answer a set of questions. Or maybe it's just one question. It's a couple of different ones for today. But reflect more than summarize. The last part here is the grading section. We use a rubric that we've put into Canvas to grade these. Here's the sort of main criteria you're being graded on: length and clarity, familiarity, that's the most important one, specificity, provide specific examples. This shows you can go back and find an example that you can put in your post, right? You can't do that if you're not familiar with the reading. If you're just skimming it really fast, you're not going to know how to do that. You're not going to be able to do that. And the last one here is follow the prompt. Answer the question. They're there to guide your thinking and tie the readings together, so make sure you're staying focused on what the prompt asks you. I try to give you room to improvise and go in different directions, but make sure you don't stray too far from the prompt. I hope you enjoy the readings. I think it's a really fun topic to think about. Look forward to your reflections, and I'll see you tomorrow.